Hello, everyone. How are you doing? You all right? All right. I've got a few Workers' Action Centre members here. So what I'm going to talk about is basically based on the work that our members and our allies have been doing at the Workers' Action Centre. One of the fundamental reasons why we're here tonight is because, the jobs that we're finding out there are not good jobs, right? And we certainly see this in our daily lives at the Workers' Action Centre. We run a hotline with workers who call with problems at work. We do a lot of education out there in the community. And it's not pretty what we're seeing, right? We're seeing a huge rise in precarious employment. We're seeing workers struggling to make ends meet, working 2 or 3 jobs. We're seeing workers trying to pay the bills and not making enough income, not getting benefits, no access to pensions. I mean, all of these sort of things that used to accompany a job are now becoming a thing of the past unless we do something about it. And I think when we talk about job security, I mean, what we are seeing is massive insecurity. We're seeing 40% of our jobs now in Canada and in Toronto be unstable jobs, work that is characterized, predominantly with unstable hours, people not knowing if they've got a job next week, where if you get a 6-month contract, you think you're lucky. And so we've gotten to a situation where if you think you've got a job for 6 months or for a year, you think you're lucky. And so the conversation what we need to have is about, well, what do we want our work to look like? Do we want a decent job? What does a decent job look like? And part of that is security, job security. And part of that is stability and decent wages and decent conditions. And that is what the Workers' Action Centre has been fighting for. And so I think that it's really important for us to understand the restructuring that has been happening in the labour market. When an employer is allowed to hire someone and not pay them the same wages and not pay them the same benefits because they're hired through a temp agency or because they're hired through a subcontractor, or they can bring them in from another country through the temporary migrant workers program and pay them now, according to our lovely federal government, 15% less, then why would an employer hire you directly? What's the incentive, right? They can pay you 40% less if they hire you through an agency. They don't have to pay you benefits. They don't have to pay you the same wages. And so fundamentally, the solutions, the kinds of recommendations that I'm bringing forward tonight are about rebuilding the floor of protection and legislation in our labour market, because we have lost a lot in the last 20 to 30 years. We have fundamentally lost a lot of basic labour standards and basic labour protection that can actually protect us when we go to work. And so what we're really talking about is, if we're going to be paying attention to job security, we need to pay attention to the 6 million workers in our province that rely on employment standards for basic conditions such as getting paid for your wages. And that is not what we're seeing in this province. We're seeing workers dealing with wage theft, where they are dealing with not going to work, with going to work and not getting paid. And that's going to happen when you have a province where there are only 30 employment standards inspectors for the whole of the province for 6 million workers. And you only got 30 inspectors to inspect 370,000 workplaces. I don't think it takes too much working out of the formula there to realize that not a lot of people are going to have their workplaces inspected. And so what we've seen is there's a lot of confidence out there in breaking the law and a lot of fear amongst workers, because let's face it, at the end of the day, we have to take care of our families and pay the bills. And so if your employer is not going to pay you overtime, and if they're not going to pay you for the upcoming public holiday that we've got next week, well, you know what? You're not going to say nothing, right? Because you're going to lose your job. And we can't afford to lose our job with the kinds of unemployment rates we're seeing out there. So let's get into some solutions. I have leaflets in the front there, which talk about this in a lot more detail. But basically, we've been talking about how do you stop wage theft? How do you ensure that workers get paid? How do you deal with issues of job insecurity? Well, you make all employers follow the law. You enforce employment standards. You require employers who break the law to pay a penalty and to actually get fined so that they won't break the law again. You give workers assistance to enforce their rights, and that you make sure you go after companies and sectors where there's high rates of employment standards violations. You update the law so that if someone's working through a temp agency or through a subcontractor or is part-time or a temporary worker or a casual worker, or, you know, working through a labor leaser or a broker or a franchisee owner, that it doesn't mean that they can't get access to their rights because of how they're hired. It shouldn't matter how you're hired. You should have access to equal pay for equal work, equal access to benefits and to the protections that we should all have. There should be a bottom floor of rights. If we don't fight for that, we are basically, we're in that situation right now, right? And so what we're talking about is equal pay for equal work, no discrimination in pay and working conditions for workers, and protecting workers from being penalized when they try and get their rights on the job. I think it's really critical in this conversation that we make the links with what's happening on a federal level, with the kinds of changes that are happening with immigration laws, where workers are being brought in and being paid less and are tied to employers, have their accommodation tied to their employers, have to live in their employers' houses as living caregivers, and have no protection, no access to protection if they speak up. And I think if we don't do that, again, we are in a situation where we are creating a second, third, fourth tier class of workers, and we've got to make the links with what's happening. I know Laurel will be talking more about employment insurance, but basically, you know, workers are being pitted against each other. And so when your federal immigration minister says that if a Canadian worker is not going to take a job and an employer can't find them, then they can bring in a migrant worker within 10 days and pay them 5 to 10 to 18% less, then what does that say in how we think about people from other countries coming in and doing the work that we don't supposedly want to do, and from allowing workers to have such little power that they can get deported if they speak up for their rights? We have a problem on our hands, and we need to make the links there. So what we're talking about is we need to remove barriers to employment rights and protections facing migrant workers and workers with precarious immigration status. We need immigration reform, which includes permanent residency for workers coming in and allowing workers to come into this country and get access to status, just as our families have been able to do, just as my family has been able to do coming into this country. And just on that note, there is a demonstration tomorrow at noon at 25 St. Clair at the Immigration Centre there around the bill around employment insurance and migrant work. The other thing is support Bill 77. Bill 77 is right now in Queen's Park. It's a Fairness for Employees Act. It provides some steps to improve workers' access to unionization. So workers can have a voice at work and try to bring in a union in their workplace. And there is Bill 79, which is on the books there, which is bringing back card certification for workers interested in forming a union. I was also asked to speak on minimum wage. It's very hard to do in 5 minutes. So all of minimum wage is supposed to ensure that when you work, you earn enough to live on. I can imagine that any of you in the room who's making $10.25 or less know that that is absolutely not true. You cannot live on $10.25 in Toronto. And so our proposal, and again this proposal is on the table there, is to bring the minimum wage 10% above the poverty line. We think it's not enough to just bring you to the poverty line. We need to bring families and workers out of poverty. So we believe That, thank you. Yes, this is our next one of our struggles. We need to bring the minimum wage 10% above the poverty line by 2015 using the low income measure. So we're setting out a bunch of principles that we'd like to put forward. Using the low income measure, we are calculating the minimum wage at a work week of 35 hours, because the work week now, because of precarious the nature of work, the average work week now is 32 hours per week. So if you base the minimum wage on 40 hours, it actually doesn't sort of, capture the reality in the labor market. So if you base the low income measure 10% above the poverty level at a 35-hour work week, we think that that is something that we need to consider. Basically, that would mean you would look at, by 2015, a minimum wage of $14.50. So have a think about that. Take a look at the proposal, and let us know what you think, because this is not going to happen unless we all stand up and fight for this, right? So basically, let's increase the minimum wage to bring workers out of poverty, and of course index annually with the cost of living, so that we don't have to keep talking about these over and over and over again, and making sure that politicians understand that the poverty level needs to be kept up with rates of the minimum wage needs to be kept with the poverty level. Okay, so those are some very practical solutions. We have these in a lot more detail in the handouts on the table, and it's thanks, Maureen. It's at 11:30 at 25 St. Clair Avenue East, which is basically at Yonge and St. Clair, at the Immigration Canada office, and I really urge you to come out and show your support to fight for our employment insurance system, so that workers can actually get access to it and not be penalized for losing their jobs, and that migrant workers are not penalized for being migrant workers and being paid less than the rest of us. And so it's important for us to make the links. Thank you.